Following the recent protests here in Portland and around the country, there has been increased scrutiny on how law enforcement is handling these protests and protesters, especially as it comes to gathering intelligence or information on them.
Yeah, protesters and the journalists reporting on these protests. Democratic Congressman Denny Heck, he represents the 10th District of Washington State and serves on the House Intelligence Committee, recently introduced a piece of legislation called the Restrictions on Intelligence Assets in Protests Act. It seeks to limit and better define the surveillance that can happen on lawful protesters. He joins us live this morning to talk about the bill and the other investigations happening right now on Capitol Hill. Denny, thanks so much for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So right now, first, let's take a look at this legislation you proposed. What really spurred that here? What have you been observing? What has your committee been observing that really kind of contributed to this new bill?
Well, we've been receiving reports that national law enforcement related agencies have been used to spy on American citizens who were engaged in peaceful protests. That's a pretty egregious violation of what the founders had in mind in both Amendment 1 and Amendment 4 of the Bill of Rights. And so we developed this legislation. It does three things very simply. It says, you can't use national law enforcement agencies to spy on American citizens engaged in peaceful protest, nor on the journalists who are covering them. Secondly, it requires these agencies to continue to operate within their lane when they do gather intel. So, for example, the Drug Enforcement Agency couldn't be gathering intelligence except in furtherance of its mission. And thirdly, because there are mixed reports, there is a requirement that the Office of the Director of National Intelligence cough up the truth about exactly what's happened here in the use of these federal agencies for this purpose.
And why would law enforcement need to gather information on lawful protesters? Is there any reasoning behind this besides the fact of just trying to get as much information as possible?
I can see no reason whatsoever that intelligence gathering should be conducted by a federal agency on peaceful protesters or the journalists covering them. So to put this in big perspective and take a step back, the First Amendment to our Constitution obviously guarantees us the right to speech and to assembly, what we would call today peaceful protest, and also freedom of press, that is the right for journalists to cover those activities. And of course, the Fourth Amendment protects us against unlawful searches and seizures. I guess due process and warrants would be required in accordance with the Fourth Amendment. So you can't be just taken up off the streets of Portland if you're peacefully protesting and thrown into the back of an unmarked van and whisked away to an unnamed location. This just attempts to put sideboards on that and to uphold the values of our founders. We introduced it just last week. We're beginning to get co-sponsors, and I'm delighted to say already my good friend Congressman Earl Blumenauer from Portland has joined on us in co-sponsorship, I wanted to add.
I know we're going to continue to follow this bill as it makes its way through some of that process here in both the House and the Senate. But I also wanted to ask you about some of the investigations maybe happening within your committee right now. Can you shed some light on what lawmakers might be looking into here in keeping tabs on the protests? I know we have seen evidence of surveillance in the Pacific Northwest at some of the original protests that sparked up after the death of George Floyd. What exactly is the concern that lawmakers are looking into where the federal government is involved?
That they've willfully violated the Constitution of the United States. That's our concern. And our objective is to get at the truth. Beyond that, obviously, I can't say. Please remember that the House Select Committee on Intelligence meets in a bunker-like facility 3 floors below the United States Capitol building. We have to go through 3 bank vault-type doors to get into it. And our proceedings, until such time as they are later revealed, are of course classified.
And real quickly, before we head out, what are some of the restrictions that this legislation then would put in place?
Well, again, it would prohibit the use of intelligence gathering or surveillance by federal agencies on peaceful protesters or the journalists covering them. And might I just add, as somebody who was a journalist for 10 years, I can't tell you how strongly I feel about the need to protect the First Amendment freedom of press guarantees that our founders wrote into the Constitution. Secondly, it would say to these agencies, you can't just do this if it doesn't have anything to do with the objective of the mission of your agency. Again, earlier I used the example of the Drug Enforcement Administration. You can't just, federal law enforcement agencies can't become fungible national police force. That was not what the founders had in mind. And it is furthermore not what was intended by the authorizing legislation for each of these agencies. So you can't do that. And then lastly, again, thirdly, the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence, you got to cough it up, man. You got to tell us exactly what you did and when and where and why, and help us understand if this is in keeping with your statutory charge or if it is in fact, as we strongly suspect, a violation of the Constitution. Look, nobody is pleased at all with the amount of property damage that is going on in some of our communities. But the truth of the matter is we have constitutional rights and guarantees that must be respected. And that's the purpose of this legislation.
All right. Well, we appreciate you sharing your insight on the new legislation, Congressman. I'm sure we'll continue to follow it here at home as it moves again through committee. Thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you very much.